Good evening, everyone. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Coast and Strait Salish people who invite the University of Victoria and us on their traditional territory to host events like this, and welcome you to the City Talks in our 5th year here in Victoria. My name is Deborah Kern, and I'm in the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria. And the City Talks is put on by the Committee for Urban Studies, which is a group of individuals at UVic who are interested very broadly in urban stuff. And we are supported in the work that we do, primarily the City Talks, although we do some city walks and some other things on campus, primarily from a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, as well as support from a variety of departments and faculties at UVic, including social sciences, law, the Department of Geography, Department of History, and political science. The theme for this fall's talks is environmental justice, which is well recognized in particular in the United States as broadly the study of the disparate impacts that communities, racialized communities and impoverished communities feel in terms of their impact, or the impact of negative environmental consequences, primarily from decision-making around where contaminated site dumps are going to go or polluting industries. We don't have such a robust discussion or sort of discipline in Canada that looks systematically at environmental justice, and hence that is the reason why we have the talks for this fall, to explore that topic. Not only in a Canadian context, but as you'll hear tonight, in a broader and certainly globalized topic. In September, we had Dana Scott from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, and she spoke about ecological citizenship. In October, we had Jeff Masuda, who's at Queen's University. He spoke about environmental justice discourse in Canada, particularly from a racial perspective. And tonight we have Julie C. join us from the University of California at Davis. Just before I introduce Julie, I wanted to let you know that the theme for the spring term is racism, memory, and politics in the European city. So let me introduce Julie, who's come to us from Sacramento, where they have had a very long-standing drought, although she's not going to talk about that tonight, I don't think. She's an associate professor and director of American Studies at the University of California at Davis. She's also the founding director of the Environmental Justice Project for UC Davis's John Muir Institute for the Environment. And as part of the Institute, she's been the faculty advisor and one of the main people behind a book project called 25 Stories from the Central Valley, which is an ongoing research project in the Central Valley on the lived experience of residents, particularly farm workers, and the variety, very large number of environmental justice concerns that are raised in that area. Her research focuses on environmental justice and inequality, race, gender, and power, and urban community health and activism. Her first book, called Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice, she analyzes the culture, politics, and history of environmental justice activism in New York City in the context of privatization, deregulation, and globalization. And in 2 short months, in January 2015, her second book will be released, and that is the topic of her talk tonight. It's titled Fantasy Islands, Chinese Dreams and Ecological Fears in an Age of Climate Crisis. And it explores urban development in Shanghai within the context of globalization, the discourse of green and ecology, and the internationalization of consulting firms. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Julie C. for tonight's talk.
Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. And apologies for the people who were at my lunch talk, so there will be some repetition from today. When Deborah asked me to come and speak, and she said, well, the theme is environmental justice, is environmental justice, that's it? And I said, oh, and it's city talks and urban. So I said, well, okay, well, I have this new book on China out, but it's not really about environmental justice. Do you want me to talk about that? And she said, okay, come talk about that. So this talk is a hybrid talk, actually. Because there is not actually that much environmental justice in China that I'm going to talk about. So it's actually not, so I'll try to do more, and in doing so, we'll probably not satisfy anyone. So I just wanted to throw that out as a disclaimer. Because I was saying, oh, I could do environmental justice because I'm doing some climate justice work, I'm doing this work in the Central Valley, but that's not urban. And Deborah said, come talk about your China book. So I'm trying to shoehorn a few things, and it might be an uncomfortable, not quite coherent thing. So I'm just going to put that out there. So the talk today is drawn from my book, which I have just got the first copies a couple weeks ago, which examines how flows, fears, and fantasies are at play in contemporary urban and global environmental culture. And I look at these flows, fears, and fantasies and how they operate on multiple geographic scales. The local scale, the urban scale, the regional context, and also the global, with a particular focus on Shanghai. So before I get to this, let me just tell you the backdrop of how I got into this topic, because I worked on New York before, and I've done 7 years of work on the Central Valley region in California. And the Central Valley region, just to give you a context, is like the not pretty, not rich part of California. And so it's much poorer, much more working class, much more immigrant, farm worker, non-citizen, and the Central Valley region is the agricultural region for California, but also arguably is the breadbasket for the US. There's a lot of industrial agriculture. There's a lot of pesticide problems, water. The worst air quality in the US has been measured in these tiny farm worker towns in the Central Valley. There's a huge prison boom. There have been 20 prisons built in the last 25 years in the Central Valley region and one university. And so a lot of my work has been focusing on connecting the environmental and social landscape of the Central Valley and connecting the activism. The activists themselves are connected, you know, the anti-prison activists and the farm worker activists. So that's been the heart of what I've done in my earlier work in New York. And so this work on China seems really, really different, and I just want to tell you a story about why I started from this. So in 2006, I started reading in the newspapers and in the different press and Wired and, you know, all these other magazines that there was going to be this really awesome eco-city that was going to be carbon neutral and zero waste. And I'm an environmentalist, so I said, oh, that's cool, where's it going to be? And then I said, oh, it's going to be on Chongming Island. Chongming Island is where my father is from, and it's where my family's from. And it is by no stretch of the imagination a place where the amazing eco-future is going to be taking place. There was a disjunct between how Chongming was talked about and what I understood of this island and this region. And so that was the initial catalyst for it. I'll go more about what Chongming Island is and where it is in relation to Shanghai. But let's just start briefly with the recently announced climate deal. And so this was just announced last year. It was secretly negotiated. And it basically, these are the basic facts of, that the US and China have agreed together to start to limit emissions. And a lot of these issues are things that are very interesting to me in the first chapter of my book, which is really talking about the US and its relationship to China and vice versa. And how the issues of consumption and production are linked. For example, there's a lot of political and cultural discourse in the US, I'm not sure what it's like in Canada, about sort of Chinese pollution and Chinese lead on toys and contaminated pet food and all these bad things that are coming from China. And there's a lot of ways in which people talk about the carbon emissions coming from China as this kind of big, evil, bad thing, of which it is. And the air pollution in a lot of the West Coast is directly related to factory emissions in China. About half of the air emissions on any given day on the West Coast of the US and presumably Canada as well. So that there's this synergistic relationship between the US and China in particular. And that was partly what I wanted to explore. And I wanted to explore it as someone who was interested in environmental issues, but also interested in the construction of race and power and the other fundamental issues around just social movements, the things that really orient the bulk of what I've done thus far. So some of the questions that have really kind of dominated the discussions around carbon treaties has been, intransigence by China and India to cut emissions, because they're basically saying, okay, well, everybody has already polluted. you've already had, a jump start in development and pollution, therefore, why are you limiting our ability to grow? And so I think what's really interesting about this carbon, this deal that was recently announced is that it explicitly links the fates together. And it's not saying that, that one country does it and the other is kind of off the hook. And so the issues of temporality and spatiality are things that are really important, for me to look at. There's this whole issue about carbon debt and carbon, futures and how you count, basically. And also, the issues of how do you count, if there have been some studies that say, well, Chinese emissions, if you counted where the emissions were produced for, British emissions, like British companies, if you were going to count their emissions as British emissions, if they're for British companies and British consumers, then the British numbers like skyrocket and so on. So there are all kinds of interesting questions about how do you count, how do you account for history, how do you account for race and global power relations. So that's sort of the framework in which I went into this study to kind of, that was really came out of this, very personal kind of like, that's weird, that's not what I understand of this island. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. So this book is really focused on four case studies in the Shanghai region. Even though the title says it's about China, it's not really about China, it's about Shanghai. The Dongtan eco-city that I already told you about, the zero-waste carbon neutral city that was supposed to be put on ecologically sensitive wetlands that are where they're a very important stopping ground for a lot of birds on this international bird flyway, so they're protected under the Ramsar Convention. So the Dongtan eco-city was supposed to be 500,000 people built on these ecologically sensitive bird habitat. It wasn't built, and I'm going to go through that in a second. So that's one chapter that I look at. Another is the broader ecological development discourse on Chongming Island itself. So Dongtan was one eco-city on one part of a very large island. But there was a lot of other ecological development also happening separate from that. There's this one city, 9 towns development, which is basically a suburbanization plan that tried to build these housing developments in the architectural style of these nations. So there was an English town, a Canadian town, an Italian town, a German town, and so on. And so, but a lot of those towns used natural images and nature motifs in how they presented what that nation looked like. And then the Shanghai World Expo, which was the World's Fair that happened in 2010, which was a very large, very big spectacle in many ways, and in which urban and environmental issues was a very big thread of the World Expo event. So, as I said, the trajectory that connects these projects are all very different geographic sites and also very different issues. So the first book really looked at a lot of garbage and air pollution, energy deregulation. The second set of Central Valley issues I've looked at really deals with pesticides and air and health. And Fantasy Islands is really focusing on kind of the top-down environmental issues that come from an architecture and engineering standpoint. So even though these are all really different kinds of places and topics, I think what really ties them together is that I'm really focused on how community identity and places are in flux and actually in context, contested. They're contested by different actors in spatial, political, and ideological contexts. And the fundamental thing that always connects the work that I do is a question or a focus on power, and how political power is expressed and resisted sometimes, spatially, metaphorically, and in practice. So the main question that motivates the Shanghai book is how Shanghai's version of urban sustainability reflect a contradictory set of what I call eco-desire. And I basically, try to develop this concept of eco-desire in the different case studies and how eco-desire operates for different actors in different moments. So the key questions that guide the book are why and how are Shanghai developers, urban planners, politicians, aided by global architecture and engineering firms integrating ideas about sustainability into their own urban futures? And what kind of lessons can we learn about Chinese eco-city development, international urbanism, and sustainability more general? How are urban environments and their transformations represented, and what's at stake in those representations? And what does the centrality of ecology in urban policymaking discourse mean? So I really like alliteration. You know, my first book was Noxious New York. And so, you know, the flow spheres and fantasies are really important here. But let me explain briefly what I mean. So flows include the flows of people. So part of the story is about rural to urban migration within China. It's about the flow of pollution from China to the US. It's about the flow of capital. And it's also about the flow of ideas and expertise. The fears, there are lots of different fears happening here. Part of the fear is about China's rising political power. And the broadest fear of all, the one that undergirds everything, is about climate change. And so all of this stuff is happening at the very moment when China's carbon emissions exceed that of the US, even though per capita emissions are still lower. The fantasies, I think, are about eco-cities. The eco-cities are the fantasy. But the broader fantasy is that there can be this pain-free technological capitalist solution to climate crisis that focuses inordinately on the built environment. So again, this story is not really about justice, actually. There is activism in China, and much of that, and in Shanghai, around the relocations, 18,000 people were relocated for the World Expo site on the waterfront. And some of those actors took their claims to the UN, you know, made very public and protests in a context in which, you know, protest is not, you know, that acceptable. And so in this book, I really focus on power elites, in part because the architects and the engineers and the officials and the state context are the kind of overarching actors in this particular story that I'm talking about. And so I do a lot of things like interview, you know, the planners, and, you know, go to the sites, look at their videos, look at the materials they produce, and so on. And so the central argument is that a key component of urban development discourse in Shanghai has become around ecology and sustainability. But that's part of a contemporary nationalist project within China, within a global context. And so there's something that I call the Shanghai ecological that's both unique to Shanghai, but it's also representative of a new global grammar of urban sustainability. So the impulse to build eco-cities in Shanghai, or at least these versions that I'm talking about, is not because it's successful, or its significance is not because it's actually that successful in solving urban and environmental problems, but in highlighting what it takes for the Shanghai to feel less not ecological. Eco-cities are eco-desire embodied, an anti-Shanghai. And so this eco-desire is for a space that is both rural and urban, Chinese and cosmopolitan, natural and artificial, temporally transcendent yet hyper-capitalistic. So sustainability discourse in Shanghai is a Ponzi scheme, using images of ecological desire as its tenuous base. And the images of environment are everywhere, but the ecosystems and habitats are nowhere. So a lot of the book is looking at technological utopianism, ecological authoritarianism, and urban displacement and restructuring, all of which are huge topics, none of which I'm going to get into now. Here's where I tried to put in some environmental justice stuff, but I know now that it doesn't actually make sense. I'll return to this in a second, since I was talking about this anyway. So earlier today I was talking about why Shanghai is important. And why Shanghai, the discourse around Shanghai as being the city of the future and how prevalent that is. And also in terms of, you know, anybody who is interested in climate change or, you know, has to take China seriously just by the numbers itself. And part of that is about the rural to urban transition that China is projecting in the next 40 years, which is huge. Here are some pictures of the actual Dongtan wetlands site in Chongming Island. Oh, so, and this is the spatial context. This is the one I should have started with. So that's China and Shanghai, and then this is Chongming Island. And Chongming Island is a very large island. It's like the third largest island in China. It is governed as part of Shanghai, but it has its own dialect. It's a very diverse population on the island. And culturally and sort of politically, Chongming residents often feel like second-class citizens within the Shanghai municipality, even though they're technically part of Shanghai. So a lot of the book is focusing on the Dongtan story and what it was supposed to represent, and all the bold claims that were made around it. And basically, Dongtan was meant to represent a different model for Chinese sustainable urbanism, one that rejected the idea that you had to have economic development first and then environmental protection. What Dongtan was supposed to represent was that you didn't need to do that, you could do it at the same time. But it was never built. And even though it wasn't built, it's still kind of important and interesting for all kinds of reasons, in part because the model for the eco-city development is still very strong within China and also in other parts of the world.
Just a quick question. What's the scale here? So how big is that island, Dongtan Island?
It's big. It's very big. It's I think the population is, I can't remember, it's like...
So how long is that?
I do not know off the top of my head. I know it's the second largest island in China. China counts Taiwan as part of China, which it's not. But so in China, it's Hainan Island and then Chongming is the second largest. So big, but we can find that out. So what I'm interested in looking at Shanghai and the discourse of urban sustainability and how central the discourse becomes in the last 10 years is how the discourse around, the language around urban prophecy becomes more central around ecology in the last 10 years. And this is basically, this eco-city is part of it. So this is Pudong, the iconic Shanghai skyscrapers. Pudong in the 1980s looked just like Chongming. It was a very poor rural agricultural area. And there's a whole political history of the development of Pudong set alongside the development of Chongming. And there's all this competition about how they're going to develop. So basically what happens is, the Shanghai municipality does not want to develop Chongming to look like Pudong. They already have Pudong. They don't want that to happen. On the other hand, they want Chongming to be more economically integrated, more economically productive, because it's 6% of the land base. It's 20% of Shanghai's land base, but only 6% of the economy. So it's considered not productive. It's overwhelmingly rural, and so on. But what they don't want is this other skyscraper thing. So there's all this stuff about, where is Disneyland going to go? Is it going to go to Pudong or Chongming? Where's the Michael Jackson Neverland Ranch, this recreation of Michael Jackson's, place? Where is that going to go? Is it going to go to Pudong or Chongming? And there's this long, 30-year history of this kind of competition. But if you can imagine Pudong was entirely rural, entirely flat in the 80s. And so Shanghai is very much, claiming its kind of centrality in China and kind of entering the ranks of the global cities of the world, which that was its history in the 1930s, and the commercial heart of China in the last 150 years. And so what I think is interesting is how this language of prophecy really gets centered around this language of sustainability. So the key and new feature that I really focus on is the role of ecology in this kind of utopian branding of the future. So just to give you a sense of where the utopian branding happens, if you look at that blue picture, that's this long planned, salivated over trinity of the 3 large buildings. So the tallest one is the Shanghai Tower, which is the newest, and it's the second tallest building in the world after the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And the green features are a key part of its innovative design. It has an innovative double-skin facade for good insulation and energy savings. It's organized as 9 cylindrical buildings stacked on top of each other. The spaces between the 2 facade layers create 9 atrium sky gardens, and rainwater is collected for the air conditioning and the heating systems, and the wind turbines are supposed to power all the energy. So when this was announced, it won an award from the US Commerce Secretary Gary Locke in May 2010 as an example of how China and the US is working together to, quote, give a glimpse of the future of green energy, end quote. And so the building's director of design, Marshall Stravala, who's based in Houston, Texas, is the designer of the largest building in the world, the Burj the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, and he's also the builder of 2 of the other 3 tallest buildings in the world. So a lot of the work that in the book is really kind of tracing out the links between the transnational artists, architects and engineers who are kind of everywhere doing all of these interesting things. Part of the national context of this growth of sustainability discourse is obviously, when you're talking about China, you have to talk about the state. And in 2007, Hu Jintao coined this term, a harmonious socialist society, end quote. And I won't read you the long, boring quote, but basically, in 2007, he said, we must go down the path of harmonious ecological development. And there have been a huge amount of financial resources put into eco-city development and the construction of eco-provinces and significant investments in environmental protection funds and the environmental protection industry, which is growing at about 17%. Far outstripping the general other sectors of the economy. And so, you have the growth of solar panel billionaires in China and so on. So, Dongtan was supposed to be built by Arup, a global planning and engineering and design firm, which is from the UK base, but now has 45% of its staff is based in China. And so they have built in 2008 for the Olympics, they built the Bird's Nest, the Water Cube, they built Ren Pool House's CCTV tower, and the Terminal 3 at the Beijing Capital Airport. And so kind of the most iconic buildings in China. And they've also built a huge number of buildings, other parts of the world that you were probably familiar with. In 2005, the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and Hu Jintao attended a ceremony in London where Arup and SICK, the client for that was basically trying to produce Dongtan, signed an agreement to expand on their partnership to develop other eco-cities like it. And SICK is the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corporation, and they're basically the real estate arm of the Shanghai municipality, and they're one of the biggest real estate developers in China. Here are some images from the Arup book that was produced for the project. And that's a direct quote up there. Dongtan represents a quest to create a new world. And I think this kind of language and these kinds of images are actually really interesting because what they do is kind of show the utopianism and the spectacular fantasies and creationists that are at the heart a lot of these projects. And a lot of the book is focused on the role of imagination and words and images in kind of both constructing the problem of hyper-urbanization and what I think that this triptych of images does is basically visually show the system through which, the ideological belief system through which you could believe that a 500,000 person city on ecologically sensitive wetlands is good for the environment, which is what they say, Arup says it is. Whether or not they believe it, I can't evaluate whether they believe it or if they just say it as PR, but that's what they say. And so I think it's important to understand how that actually happens. So the question of why Dongtan failed is a complicated one. Here's some more images of Dongtan, and just to give you a more sense of this, like science fiction, surreal, images in that text. Dongtan, the main proponent of it was the Shanghai Communist Party chief, and he was sentenced to 18 years in prison for corruption. There were also different political conflicts between Arup and SICK. They claimed that they didn't know who was paying for what. There was changing national policy over farmland taking. There were tensions between the Chongming County government and the Shanghai municipality, even though Chongming is part of Shanghai. And there were values, the chairman of the board of SICK retired in 2008, and he was also a big proponent of it. And there were values differences about whether it should be have cars or be car free. But to me, the question of why Dongtan failed are also rooted in the contradictions, I think, inherent in eco-city development. The idea that, and then the lack of cultural understanding and the erasure of geographic and historical context. And so, I have a lot of quotes in here about people who were moved for the site and saying, I was moved to a green building, I don't know what green means, I can't really farm anymore because I can't get to my, farmlands and so on. So the questions of displacement, which, you know, Arup says nobody was displaced, but that's actually not factually true. In addition to the actual displacement, there's a lot of regional restructuring on the island itself. Part of that is because of the larger issues around space and time, that the island was connected in 2009. It was time to go with the World Expo by this bridge, this very long. It's the longest bridge and tunnel combination in the world. And so I have a whole chapter, we're on an island, right? You know, about island discourse and how, you know, people talk about islands as being isolated and, you know, there all this anxiety, island anxiety, and how that becomes, you know, dealt with through the kind of technological marvel of the bridge. And so, you know, and of course, you know, people who've written on islands know that that's actually not true. The most cosmopolitan people are people on islands because they're the ones who are always traveling back and forth. And my own family, you know, were sailors, and there's a strong history of maritime culture on Chongming. A lot of the most famous, you know, captains in China come from Chongming Island. But just to give you a sense of, you know, what it was like, you know, my father moved to Shanghai, you know, when he was young, but he would go to the island once a year. And so that, I think it's 16 miles, would take 5 hours to get from Shanghai when he was growing up in the 40s. When I went in 2009, the boat ride was an hour, and now you can get there in 20 minutes. You know, and so there's all these really interesting things about space-time compression, but also just about economic development and ecological transition, because there's also going to be another bridge built on top of Chongming Island to go up to the province up. So a lot of this is about the regional transformation as well. Let me see what I have time for. I'm not keeping track at all of my time. So one of the other chapters is looking at the World Expo, which was, you had World Expos, you know, near here in Vancouver and Montreal and so on. So, what was interesting about the World Expo is the first one in China. It was the first one that was supposedly focused on urban issues. There's a lot of interesting things in the expo development of the site. There was a lot of public infrastructure that was actually built, so the number of tracks for the Shanghai subway system grew really quickly. And so Shanghai went from having no subway system, I think like, I don't know, 10 years ago, to having the largest number of tracks in the world. And, you know, so there's a lot of ways in which the expo is different from the other cases because there actually are a lot of urban and environmental improvements that came along with the infrastructure development for the World Expo. But I do a really close reading of these of some of the pavilions, not the national pavilions. I don't know if you know a lot about the World Expo, but basically there are national pavilions where the nations are supposed to build what represents their culture. And so, you know, there's, I didn't go to the Canadian building, but, you know, the US building was horrible. And it was completely built by corporate sponsorship, cost $63 million. And it was literally plastered in like Dow Chemical, you know, Disney, blah, 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 blah. Other countries that are more interested in the architectural kind of like, you know, this is our showcase, like actually the United Arab Emirates moonscape building was very beautiful. So a lot of nations invest millions of dollars to kind of showcase their power. And so again, the issue of branding and sort of spectacularness through a physical space is something that is very much true in the World Expo. And just to give you a context, some of the lines to get into the World Expo, like the most popular buildings, to get into the moonscape one, you had to wait 6 to 7 hours to get into the building. And sometimes to get into the expo site itself, you would have to wait 5 hours to get into the site. I mean, these were very, very huge numbers of people to visit. In my World Expo chapter, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the World Expo, but I really focus on the special pavilions, so the urban planet, the pavilion of city being. And basically what I'm trying to look at is how nature and environmentalism are being talked about in there. And part of what is happening is there's a shift between the rural to the environmental. And that's part of the broader argument of the book, is that what is happening when ecology is kind of really taking over in this particular way in these projects is that there's this new way in which ecology is supposed to bring value to something that actually isn't value in a rural context, in a rural peasant context. Some images of the flashy subway that was built. Just to give you a brief, I'm jumping around, so I'm just giving you like the greatest hits of like the most interesting images from the book, and then I want to spend a lot more time on questions, because actually today I didn't have a chance to have questions, and I'm sure you have some. So this is the 9 towns, the One City, 9 Town project, and that's the initiated in 1994. And this was supposed to house a total of 1 million or more newcomers by 2020. And so each of these 9 towns would be modeled on a European nation in a purportedly authentic style of that nation. So you had England, Spain, Swedish/Northern European, Dutch, Italian, German, and 2 built in a Chinese style, though that Chinese style was built by an American architect who did the redevelopment of Faneuil Hall in Boston. So 2 of them were explicitly environmental, but all of them had sort of green themes. And so let me show you some of the images. This is the Thames town, the English town. So you have statues of like Clara Barton and famous English people. You have this church, which is basically an empty facade. There's literally nothing in it. It has no function other to be an empty site where people get married in front of. You have some beautiful recreation. A friend of mine who's a British architectural historian was like kind of impressed by the aesthetics of the reproduction itself. These are just the contrast between the World Expo, this village, this film that was talking about the eco-city, and then the deer. I like this deer contrast with Townestown. Here's some pictures of the German town, which I don't know if you can read that over there, but it basically says low carbon living. This is the Northern European town and the Italian water town. So in all these towns you can see that natural images and concepts are embodied and built into the national characters of these developments as a way to imagine the virtues of ecology in a real estate development in the hyper-urbanizing Shanghai context. So what's at stake here, I think, is that natural images represent, in some ways, an ecological greenwashing in the real estate context. But what's also being worked through is the role of the middle-class Chinese consumer in a new suburban vision to create new ecological subjects in a broader national, environmental, and social context where the question of how economic land use and environmental harmony, again, harmony is a specific word with a specific valence in China, can coexist remain an open question. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book is talk about suburbanization and the skyscraper development and the eco-city as all part of the same set of pressures. And to understand suburbanization and isolation from the global ambition of the central city would be to misunderstand both suburb and central city. So the reconciliation between the suburb and the city is managed through ecological desire, the concept of eco-desire that I'm trying to develop here, and set against a national and a global stage. And so this focus on improving the city, who is the better city, better life for? Who is it for? It's not very clear unless you really spend some time thinking about it. Is a result of Shanghai's intense and fast-paced urbanization, population, and development pressures. So I think what's important to understand is that Shanghai has literally been reshaped in the last 10 years in ways that are far exceed anything that we can understand here. The amount of displacement, urban displacement in Shanghai alone is bigger than what 40 years of urban renewal in the US did, just in sheer numbers. And so the residents of Shanghai have faced a great deal of change in the physical and ideological landscapes of the city, and sustainability is a key part of that change. So in the One City, 9 Towns project, nature and nation are conflated in particular ways and for particular ends that connect Dongtan through to the World Expo and the Chongming ecological development writ large. So in part, eco-desire is the fusion of nature and nation together to represent a particular version of transformation, modernity, and cosmopolitanism in contemporary Shanghai amidst both urban and suburban development policy. I'm kind of jumping around a lot because I forgot to check my time, and so I wanted to do that. But I wanted to end also with one quote, actually a couple of quotes. One is the historian Jeff Wasserstrom, who is focused on global Shanghai. And he argues that Shanghai's rise as a global city in a comparative context can be understood, should be understood historically. And so he says, is global Shanghai a good way to think? And I think the answer is yes. Not just as a global urbanist, but as someone who's interested in urban and environmental research more broadly. Shanghai is, like New York City in my earlier work, a good place to think about, a very good place to think about global ecology and urban transformation. The Shanghai Ecological is an important part of urban development discourse and to understanding China's environmental policy strategy more broadly. And so Dongtan and the World Expo and the One City, Nine Towns exemplifies the many contradictions, complexities, and paradoxes within China in a global and warming world. So the question of how urban environments transform and change is a political one, but it's also a cultural one. And so part of what the book is trying to do is to use many different kinds of methods and sources to understand how ideas of urban and global citizenship in a comparative context can be better understood by using different approaches, not just one only. And so fundamentally what I'm interested in is how ideas of sustainability change when they travel across time and space. And how do transnational architecture and engineering firms homogenize global urban culture and sustainability discourse? And how do those ideologies work themselves in actual built environments and affect actual people's lives? And part of the broader project for me is that sustainability is everywhere, but it doesn't mean anything. So part of what we think we have to do is to really think about what sustainability means. And part of why sustainability is so powerful is that it's such a powerful concept that people can attach all different types of meanings to. And so for me, the idea of situated sustainability is the one that I'm really interested in. So situated both politically and also spatially. China is a good place to see the state of global transnational environmental sustainability schemes because of the particular historical and national context that make it amenable to its adoption as a policy, if not practice. So I think the question is, a lot of the book is like critique and analysis. But my reviewers said, well, you can't just do critique and analysis, that's not very helpful. Like what else can you do? What else can you offer us? Other than critiquing techno-fetishism and techno-utopianism. So I said, okay, fine. So this was my one paragraph answer. I would argue that there's nothing inherently wrong with eco-desire, just the ways in which eco-desire is mobilized in the cases that I discussed in Shanghai. But what's more necessary and more complex is what's exactly missing in these cases: a sense of humility, a pause in capitalist growth and development, and the ability to get past a staunch refusal to see how technological and engineering solutions create their own environmental and social burdens. And so what characterizes the city optic, what Warren Magnuson calls seeing like a city, versus James Scott's seeing like a state, is a fundamental faith in change, fluidity, and humility. So Scott explores these values suppressed by the state in the Greek concept of metis. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So metis is practical and cunning intelligence, and it stands as an effective antidote to the natural and social features of state power. The essence of metis is knowledge about when and how to apply rules of thumb to concrete situations. And in his exhaustive study of contemporary Chinese environmentalism, Jonathan Watts, this book is fabulous, it's called When a Billion Chinese Jump. And he really does like the hard work, he was the Guardian environmental correspondent, of interviewing like the hundreds of activists all around China that are working to make environmental change in their very different contexts. So he interviews many hundreds of dedicated environmentalists, scientists, peasants, and farmers working today. And one tiny yet illustrative example of menace, he quotes an expert on alpine ecology working in Yunnan, to show how village forest collection practices are more sustainable than current government practice. And so this call to revalue traditional ecological and indigenous knowledge has strong scientific bases when analyzing the data, but it's not merely a scientific imperative. It's also a rejection of the state-sanctioned impulse to see like a state and to seek mastery over nature. So my answer, which isn't really an answer because it's not really a prescription, is that we need more humility and we need more self-reflexivity in the pressing nature of environmental problems in what has been called the Anthropocene, or the era in which human impacts have shaped geologic time. In the very decade in which overall carbon emissions from China have exceeded that of the US, a sophisticated analysis of global environmental problems, like climate change, has to take race, space, history, and global power seriously. If we don't do that, what we do is fall upon racialized tropes that see the rise of India and China through the interpretive lens that framed Asian population growth in apocalyptic and frankly racist terms in the 1950s and 60s. And so the larger political dimension of Asian Pacific, Pacific Islander, immigrant and refugee environmentalism in the US and the environmental justice movements, not just in the US but globally, can't be separated from each other. They're all part of the same struggle. And so I think ultimately, even though this talk seemed like two different talks, the issues of environmental justice and these examples, I think, of failed projects are again two sides of the same coin. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that and then open it up for questions. I have a whole other component of the work that I've done around Chongming size is 1,400 kilometers. So,
Can you repeat that, please?
1,400 kilometers.
Square kilometers.
About 40 by 20 miles. 40 by 10 rather.
What are can I ask a question?
Yes.
What are who's driving this in terms of, is it Western consulting firms coming in and saying this is what you should have? Or is it the Chinese municipal leadership driving this? And I guess building on that, who's looking at the wellness of the citizen in all of this?
That is a great question. I think the architecture and engineering firms are, they're the technocrats that are building these projects for particular clients. And so I think in the Dongpan case, the client is sick. And in the Chinese context, a lot of, there's the separation between public and private is not the same, So in a lot of ways, it's the state. And so the question of who is it for and who's looking out for the interests, this goes back to the question of the thing I was saying about better city, better life. I mean, who, better for who, and how are you going to measure that? And, so what was interesting in the World Expo is that there's a diorama where there are these peasants that are talking about how their life is going to be better when they move to this, green place. And there are lots of other examples. There was an eco-village called Huang Baiyu, which got a lot of attention, and it was closely associated with a very famous architect in the US called William McDonough, the whole cradle-to-cradle thing. And this village also was, touted as the future of sort of sustainability. And that was actually built, and it's been an utter failure. The peasants, it's too expensive, they can't afford it, they cannot farm anymore, there are spaces for cars and none of them have cars, And so again, this question of what is the end point of this? I think part of the end point is about the urban transition and about the state trying to, basically go from a rural, unproductive population, what they see as unproductive, to productive consumers. And so part of this is about the transformation of revaluing nature but not in a way that values peasants, but it sort of leverages natural capital. So they want Chongming to be productive like Pudong, but they're not going to do it in a skyscraper way. And the way that they do it is through leveraging what they're using, Amory Lovin's natural capital concept. And actually, if you read the Arab book, they talk a lot about Vancouver, and they talk a lot about, Vancouver is and the Everglades. Like, there's certain sites for them is like that. If they get to that place, they're very happy,
You can actually a little bit similar direction when you say about who looks after the people. You were saying about this one city, 9 towns.
Mm-hmm.
Do people decide individually as families where they want to live?
Mm-hmm.
Is that close to where they work?
Mm-hmm.
Or is there a more central organization who decides?
That is a really good question. And I think, a lot of this has to do with the changing policy around separating people from their the hukou system. So before you couldn't move, and that's why the migrant situation is so terrible. Because so many people have moved from their villages to places like Beijing and Shanghai, and they can't access resources because their registration goes back to their village. And so in the last few decades, part of the context again is that there's been a decoupling of where people live and the services they receive. And so it's partially about the rise of the property market in China. And so this is not a top-down, like you must live here, except in the case of the Italian town, which is where the people who were displaced from the World Expo were moved there explicitly. But other than that, it's much more seen as we have to be an attractive, amenity-based property development. And these are seen as property investments for most of the people who live there. And not as places where people live primarily. So we were talking about this at lunch. So most of the towns are completely empty and falling apart, but they are successful real estate ventures. They're fully sold. They're I don't know if they're successful investments, but they have been bought and sold. And so I think that's another good question. The only case where it's really top down, like you must live there, is really around the World Expo relocation people in the Italian town. Otherwise, it's much more kind of the free-for-all of the expansion of the private property market and all of the pains and change that has happened in Shanghai in particular, but in China, in general in the last 15 years, the amount of change and the scale and the scope of it is really massive. I mean, it's not just a little, it's like a lot, So, I don't know if that answers your question.
It's when you say the houses are empty, how can that be a good investment?
Well, I don't know that it's a great investment, but I'm saying from the standpoint of the developer, they've
So
sold
the
their,
developer sold it,
yes.
but then what happens next?
I don't know. They're very interesting sites. I think the only people who go to Thamestown are the people who go and get their wedding pictures taken, and then Western scholars who are like, what is this place and what is it like? It's the most accessible of the towns. It's the only one that's really accessible by transportation. Actually, most of them are really far away from the center of Shanghai. And I was saying at lunch, I visited like 5 of the 9, and I just had to give up because it was just too depressing to go to the other 6. I couldn't convince anyone to come with me. The daughter of a friend of my family's, went very excitedly with me to the first one because she had read about Thamestown. She was like, oh, it's going to be so awesome. And then she was like, oh, God. And I was like, would you go? Would you ever live there? No. What if it was free? No, I would never live there. What if it was, what if someone paid you to live there? And she's like, no, I would never live there. So, the question of what is a successful space is a really interesting one in that context in particular. So.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how these big international companies see what they're doing in China in comparison with other parts of the world where they're working. Did you get any insight into that, how they see the kind of things that they're building in Shanghai compared to what they're building in Abu Dhabi and their relations with the authorities in these different places?
I think that if you read the literature produced by Arup and Skidmore, Owens, Merrill, and sort of these big companies, there's a lot of breathless, like, this is the future, this is the frontier, this is where we can do the most exciting, interesting thing, in part because we don't have to actually deal with dissent or, protests. And I think that's part of the problem that I have with these projects is that, and there are a lot of people who are captured by the idea of like technological authoritarianism, like, this environmentalism can be good in a state context. And that's the line of argument saying, well, we can just say, like the state, the Communist Party can just ban plastic bags. They can just do that. There's no process involved. And so there's a fascination with that ability that lends itself to a certain side of architectural history, the not great side of architectural history, I would argue. And so there's a lot, and it's pretty explicit. They talk about China as the new frontier. This is where the future is. And it's materially, that's where a lot of the client, that's where the work is. It's in these emerging economies, politically authoritarian and otherwise. And so there isn't a lot of attention to these issues. And when they are brought up, like Ah Weiwei worked with the builders of the bird's nest, and then he pulled out. Because he said that it was Herzog and de Moran, the Swiss architects. And he had a very powerful political critique that, the bird's nest was just an empty vessel. And the Herzog and de Moran was like, well, no, we are capturing the openness of the society and people will walk around it. And then the afterlife of these places is also very interesting because a lot of times they don't have an afterlife. They're just sort of, these big showcases of state power and kind of architectural innovation, and then they don't have a life beyond that. And so I think that's also part of the context. But I think that for these firms, they're very attached to building. And there's not many places where you can build, and you can build big, and you can build bold, and now sustainability is just like the cream on the crop that's letting that happen. Trying to think if there's anything else. It's also interesting because a lot of the Chinese investors are coming into the U.S. and I'm sure in Canada as well. They're the major investors behind the Treasure Island eco-city project in the Bay Area, and these other projects to redevelop polluted shipyards and to make them sort of green. And sort of brownfield redevelopment. So it's not just about Western companies going to China and doing these projects. A lot of Chinese companies are doing major development projects in the U.S. I'm sure in Canada as well. So.
He mentioned the project in, I believe it's Abu Dhabi.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that much about it, but is that a success story compared to what has gone on in China? And if so, what was the main differences?
I don't think it's a success story. I think it's a similar story, actually. I went to the Abu Dhabi, the Masdar Eco City, and it was the same kind of empty space, though not as empty as the One City, Nine Towns. They also had, I think part of the problem I have with eco-cities is that they believe that all the ecology happens in that space. And that's the fundamental conceptual problem I have with them. And so when Masdar says it's zero waste and carbon neutral, they just account for the Masdar space. They're not accounting for the people who are driving 40 miles every day to get there to work from Abu Dhabi. And so the whole question of counting, I think, is really political, and it's also very polemical. In the case of, I was trying to say, it's very complicated, like when you're talking about China and the US emissions and so And so I don't think that the Masdar case is a successful one. I think the only eco-city that I think is, and again, who knows, because I haven't actually been to this one. Arup was actually involved in an eco-city in South Africa that is very different in orientation. And it's very much based out of a local economic development workers co-op context. And I don't know anything about it, so someone can correct me and tell me that it's actually not as good either. You know what I mean? But what's interesting there is that Arup is also involved, but the political context and the ideology driving it is very, very different. So that's what, again, goes back to my point about sustainability. It's just a buzzword unless it's in the specifics of how it's operationalized. And fundamentally for me, the story of whose story gets told, the question that you are asking about, whose worldview gets privileged, is really important. And this is a good way to drive this point home related to the Central Valley Project. So this is one of the 25 stories, which was actually a master's thesis from some student, and she did oral histories of how women become activated in environmental justice issues in the Central Valley. And this woman is Sandra Moraz, and she is the first woman of color who is appointed to the local water board. And she is buying her water because there are lots of tiny communities in the Central Valley where there is no good water. You actually have to buy all the water you use. And the per capita income in some of these communities where they have to buy all the water is like less than $10,000. I mean, these are very poor places. And so the history of water rights and water usage in California is very political, as it is in most places. But in California, a lot of the water is piped through these big infrastructure projects, both federal and state, and it's used in big agriculture, and it's used to basically be the water for Southern California cities. And so, and then the water is governed through these water boards, and the water boards are not based on representation, like who lives there. What they're based on is property ownership. So basically, the big agricultural interests have always dominated the water politics. But there have been coalitions like the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, which are saying, well, actually, there are other ways that, water politics and should be talked about. And environmental justice and community concerns are part of that equation. It's not just about how the growers are going to get their, water. So she's a really, I think, powerful example of this struggle for recognition. Both actual recognition on the water board, but kind of broader recognition, like cultural recognition that, that their community and their struggle matters, even though, politically they're not the ones that drive those decisions. And that's what I think environmental justice as a social movement in the US does really well, and which there is very vehemently suppressed in the context of China, which is to say that, those voices of the peasant that was moved for this thing actually matter.
I'll ask you a different question, but following on from that, I'm just curious about what you call eco-desire, which, thinking about your slides, is partly the desire for green space and wildlife and the rural and so on, which is clearly mobilized in the context of these particular developments that are oriented towards the middle class, upper middle class. And you can see the same things happening on this continent. It's how desire for the suburbs is mobilized. And I'm just wondering whether that desire morphs and ends up in an environmental justice movement or movements of resistance or some other kind of ecologically focused activity, either in the context of Shanghai or in the context of the Central Valley. Eco-desire presumably is not something that's simply mobilized for commercial purposes. It also works in other ways politically, I would think. I haven't thought about it. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually an extension of what we were talking about at lunch when Warren was talking about the Naomi Klein book, This Changes Everything. And we were talking about I haven't read the book yet, so I'm going by his description of it, where she talks about her own child and the struggle to, become pregnant, and also how having a child probably changes your idea of the future, your desire to protect, the future, which is under very real threat under climate change. And what I was saying at lunch was that, in the US at least, there's a lot more awareness of environmental issues. I mean, much more than there was like 20 years ago, where environmental issues were kind of seen as very marginal, very fringe. Like, there were people who were environmentalists, but it wasn't something that everyone had a kind of knew what it was about. And I think now that's actually changed. I think people understand much more about environmental issues. And there's much more of a general baseline understanding of, recycling. And we can argue about, how deep a commitment it is, and how real or deep it is. But I think in the U.S. context, there's a lot of discussion about, protecting your child, from toxins. There's a lot of awareness, and especially probably in California, about banning persistent organic pollutants, getting rid of flame retardants in furniture, and there's more of a generalized awareness that there's stuff, like bad stuff, and that it might affect me and my family. I think that I think is also a form of ego desire, right? But where I think where it can go is that it can either go into this very insular, personalized place where, and the sociologist Andrew Soss calls it shopping our way to safety. So he says there's an obsession with buying organic food or drinking clean water. And what he's saying is that there's nothing wrong with those wanting pesticide-free food or clean water, but if you're going to, go for that as a desired space of purity, there's a difference between wanting that as a protection, as a consumer, that I have privilege to buy safety for my family, versus a social protection or a legislative route. And so I think, that's why at the end of the book I was saying, I don't think eco-desire is bad inherently. I think in some ways you could say, wanting to fight climate change is eco-desire some way. And, that is an eco-desire as well. But that, the form in which it takes is what's really at stake. And so for me, the form, to leverage people's desire for clean food or protect their children, or to not have, 125 industrial, pollutants in your bloodstream when you're born, those are good impulses. But, are you going to leverage them in an individualist, consumerist way that recreates different kinds of inequalities, or are you going to structurally change systems? And, you could argue that you could do both. But I think right now, it's in the U.S. It's not really about systems. It's much more about individual consumerist approaches to these things, and that ends up recreating the problem of environmentalism and privilege, which has a long history in the U.S. that environmental justice movements have been fighting for a very long time, which is a conception of the environment as wilderness, as leisure, as opposed to a more broadened sense of what environment as being everything, where you live, where you work, where you play, etc. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if it went on a totally different track. Last question?
Question, really. Enjoyed your talk. I was particularly intrigued by kind of briefly mentioned this notion of counting and the politics of calculation, in a sense. And I assume you're familiar with kind of these rating systems like LEED, gold standard, platinum, and all that sort of thing, and as kind of a way to render urban sustainability calculable within a specific site or architectural feature. And we have that a lot in North America. I was just wondering if, in terms of this notion of rendering sustainability calculable, if you encountered that in China as well, or are there different kind of ways
question. I think that it's a double-edged question, because on the one hand, there's a critique of LEED, and there's a critique of counting in that way, and there's a critique of ecosystem services, and, you know, quantifying nature, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, in China, there's not even, like, any definition of what these terms mean. So what's an eco-province, what's an eco-city, what's an ecological civilization site? Like, there's no actual definition, you know, which makes it even worse, you know. And so I think that's a really, I'm involved in a project in Dubai, and there's this is, given our conversations about the politics of research, a very fraught one, but there's a developer that has been trying to contract research on our campus around sustainability research. And they basically are trying to create sustainability indices that are locally specific. And say, you know, well, you can't use this one metric because it doesn't take, you know, this local context into account and so on. And so I think, you know, that question of counting, you know, is a very fraught one, and the question of about how you define these is very, very contested. So I don't know if I don't know enough other than that to say that I don't know how I feel, you know, about it. What I do know is that I think sustainability is a word that if you looked on Google, like, thing, it probably tracks with the rise in carbon emissions. The word sustainability probably goes up at exactly the same time. But what they mean is, like, who knows? A student of mine pointed me to a German linguist who has this idea of plastic words, and he has words like development, you know, and you know, and I'm working on an edited collection that's called Situating Sustainability, where, you know, I'm going to talk about the cases. We'll talk about what it means to situate that term. So it's something that I think is an ongoing thing, and I'm sure you know, people in this room have a lot more to say about that. So.
Well, Julie, it's my pleasure to thank you so much for joining us tonight and today here in Victoria. Your interdisciplinarity, being someone who studies, or at least teaches in American studies, but brings in all of these impacts globally, really has enriched our speaker series and taken the concept of environmental justice much farther than we sort of conceived of at the beginning. So thank you for joining us.